So our first question to consider on this topic is actually not here, but rather, so before discussing what feminism is, it's necessary to discuss what sexism is. What is sexism? Anyone want to take a shot at that? Yes. Yes, that's correct. Oppression, which is the abuse of power, specifically as it relates to sex and gender. Good. So that's question number one. Question number two, what is feminism? Anyone? Go ahead. Yes, it's the belief in equal rights for people regardless of sex or gender, and particularly for women, because after all, with very few exceptions, most societies have empowered men over women for most of their histories. So, third question: why have women traditionally been subjected to the power of men? And so we talked about. When human beings 10,000 years ago were all hunter-gatherers no matter where they lived. And although there's this strength differential, generally speaking, between men and women, which is not to say that there are not some women that are stronger than some men, but rather that, on average, men are stronger because they have more muscle mass than women and they're bigger. We have what's called in human beings sexual dimorphism. Right? We have different physical traits on the basis of sex. And one of those differences is that men are bigger and stronger. And that always could be used in dispute resolution, right? You resort to violence as a way, or the threat of violence as a way of settling a conflict. But remember that the general consensus among anthropologists is that in hunter-gatherer societies, there's fierce egalitarianism. There's the sense that everybody contributes something that is of equal value. For women, this is childbearing, nursing, and generally the direct care for children, although that falls on men as well. And again, we're still talking about hunter-gatherer societies, whereas for men that involves hunting, women share to some extent in the gathering. So that's the way that we exist as a species for tens of thousands of years, and then we begin living in settled societies. And once we begin living in settled societies, they're male-dominated. And so the question, and again, there are a couple of exceptions, but by and large, societies are dominated by men. So the question is, why is that? Does it coincide with our living in settled agricultural societies that all of a sudden this fact of male strength over women, which has always existed, now becomes something that is translates into an ongoing difference in the actual day-to-day power that the two sexes exercise? What does a settled society endow to people for the first time that it hasn't before? Right, so we talked about some of the things that come along with agriculture. Right? So if we live in settled societies now, it's because we can grow food. Which if we can grow food, then we can grow a surplus of food, which means that populations are going to grow. It means further that because populations are going to grow, there's going to be conflict that will emerge over the scarcity of resources. And when those conflicts emerge, there will be a winner and there will be a loser. And for the winners in particular, they will accrue additional resources to themselves. Right? So the main thing that happens that bears on what we're talking about today is that you can now begin to accrue property to yourself. Because before, you didn't have property. Everybody held things in common. And you certainly didn't have any surplus. You picked or, killed what you ate that day, or maybe a couple of days, but that was it. But now you have tangible wealth, things of actual value. The main one being land. But then, as societies begin to develop further, and the idea of money comes along, and coins and precious metals and all that. There's that aspect of wealth. There's slavery, of course, so the ability to own slaves is a tremendous economic value, and so that comes along. All of these things accompany agricultural society. What does that have to do with sexism? Why does it all of a sudden become incumbent upon men to exercise their control over women? And what does that have to do with property? So here's a way of understanding this. What happens to my property after I die? It's given to somebody else. And who am I as a capital owner going to want to have that property go to? Your descendants, right. So here's a wrinkle in that plan. Until 100 years ago, I had no way of knowing for sure that my children were mine. Until 25 years ago, I had no way of knowing for sure that they weren't mine. I had to go on trust, by and large. Right? Now, today, living in a multi-ethnic, multiracial society, and knowing much more about genetics, which is why we could determine first by blood test, but that only works to a certain extent. Now we can determine by DNA, and we can be 100% positive. And when these things began to be considered by people that held power, everybody that lived among one another looked alike. So unless there was some particularly distinguishing physical feature, your children were going to be the same race as you, and so you weren't going to have any big reason for suspecting that they weren't. But here's what we do know about paternity. That today, with organizations like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, do you know how often people find out that their father isn't their father? Take a guess. You would think it's a relatively small or large number. 10% of the time. 1 out of 10. And just to give you some notion of how this plays real roles in history, for instance, you might know that Queen Victoria was the Queen of England in the 19th century, and that she had a large number of children, and that these children subsequently married into most of the royal houses of Europe. And you probably further know, or maybe further know, that all of her daughters were carriers for hemophilia, and that her 2 of her sons had it, and 2 of her sons were carriers for it. So hemophilia is a disease that requires that both parents be a carrier of it to be passed along. Or, I'm sorry, requires that one parent to have it to be passed along, the father, and because it's Y-linked. I'm going to get the genetics on this wrong, so scratch that, and let's just say that it requires one parent to have it, and when they tested the parents, the carrier was Victoria, and not her husband, Albert. So then the determination had to be, well, where did she get the gene from? Did it come from her father or from her mother? And the answer was from neither. They tested her mother, didn't have the gene, tested her father, didn't have the gene. There's one of 2 explanations for that. Either this was what's called a de novo mutation. She developed the mutation, which is, happens. Or her father was not her father. So, and how does that come into the history as we discussed in this class? Well, her great-grandson, or her grandson actually, was the Tsar of Russia, and her great-grandson was an active hemophiliac. And so the succession to the Tsar of Russia in 1917 was questionable at best for that reason. So, paternity falls into question. So how are you going to make sure that your children are your own? You are going to very closely control the social activity of women. So much so that to a very large extent, and certainly this obtains in the ancient world more than in the modern world, but it continues into the modern world pretty much too. Down to the last 100 years, women will be property, and the way by which property will be transmuted to the next generation. So a woman is the property of her father until she marries, and then after she marries, she's the property of her husband. And her role, as being the property of her husband, is that she will provide children for that man to leave his property to. So, now there are, of course, lots of other sort of auxiliary aspects of male control over women that come into play over the course of a couple thousand years. But this is a big one. And that it is justified in other ways doesn't change the underlying fact that this plays a pretty big role, and that it is referred to, albeit obliquely, by Wollstonecraft in her own writing. Because when she talks about the supposed moral standards to which men and women are held, this is partly what she's talking about. And partially why is it that virginity is held at such a high value in societies, female virginity I'm talking about here, by the way, held at such a high value in a direct correlation with how sort of traditional that society is, how non-modern that society is. And the answer is because then you know that, or at least you can assume, that that any children that come out of her sexual relationship with her husband are her husband's. That there won't be a question with regard to the paternity of the children, because she will have come to her husband without having, quote-unquote, known man. Now, that's not a guarantee, but if she's property to begin with, then via that transferal, the assuring that that she continues to be chaste with the exception of the sexual partnership she has with her husband, that's now his job. And you can see, by the way that this carries over in certain societies into things like honor killings. Because it's not, and that's an extreme example, but it falls within a continuum of notions about virginity and what it signifies. If a father can't maintain the virginity of her daughter, then he's failed as a father. If a husband is given a wife who is not a virgin, then he's been cheated by that father. And these are male-dominated societies, so they're not going to kill the father as a result of that. He's going to pay some kind of fine. He's going to have some kind of social opprobrium brought upon him. He's going to be ostracized. But the woman's going to have to die, because she's going to be a physical reminder of everything that societies that are formed on this basis, on a property basis and on an inheritance basis, seeks to avoid. So yeah, you look at traditional societies, particularly those in which women are have different legal status, and you'll see things like that they're not allowed to go out in public unless they're chaperoned by their husband or a male relative, because the assumption there is that otherwise there's always the possibility she could have sex with somebody, and then the children that she brings forward are going to not be the husband's. Veiling of women, they're being required to cover their hair, is done once a woman is married in most of the societies that do this, and it's so that other men will know not to rape her. It's a sort of a physical manifestation that she is the property of somebody else, and that to rape her would be a crime against that man. It would be it's equivalent to the crime against property. So, the Ten Commandments, right? You've all heard of them at the very least, right? So you've got 10 commandments that are 5 of them basically have to do with people's relationships with God and with their parents, right? You don't take the Lord's name in vain, and you honor your parents, and you observe the Sabbath. And there are 5 rules of what you're not supposed to do. You're not supposed to kill. You're not supposed to steal. You're not supposed to commit adultery. You're not supposed to bear false witness. And the last one is you're not supposed to covet your neighbor's property. For those of you that were, like myself, raised Catholic, you might have been taught that the coveting of the neighbor's wife and the coveting of the neighbor's property are separate commandments. Only Catholics teach that. Protestants and Jews, they teach that that's one commandment. Don't covet property. And the wife's included in that, along with the cattle and with the oxen and with the donkeys. So this is how these things work out in real life for thousands of years. And again, like, rape is not a crime against the woman; it's a crime against the man's property. She's now damaged goods, and so again, she gets killed because now she's ruined basically for her purpose, and the man will get some kind of monetary compensation, maybe the daughter of the guy that raped her. Because it's all, again, it's basically a monetary transaction. So, now that doesn't go on forever, right? I mean, by the time we get to when Mary Wollstonecraft is living in the 18th century, women are in a better position. That varies from place to place, but in England, where she lives, it's better than in other places in Europe. For one thing, England has had, by this point, 3.5 monarchs who have been women, which they don't allow in France and they don't allow in Germany. They just will flat out go to the next related man rather than give the monarchy to a woman. But in England, they've done that a bunch of times. First time they did it, they went to war over it, but then subsequently after, they accepted it. So they're a little bit more progressive on this point. But there still are very real differences between men and women in terms of their rights within a society. So the next question is, well, what are women's choices with regard to what they will do as adults in the 18th century? What are basically, you have a handful of things that you can do if you are in a modern society, in a developed society, a westernized society. What are those things? What are your choices? Yeah.
Be a wife and be a mom.
Right, so that's going to be your main choice, is be a wife and be a mother. And that remains, by and large, in a legal sense, a property transaction, although women begin to assert the right to say, I don't want to marry that guy. And marriages are, to a lesser extent, arranged by the 18th century, at least in the West. In some societies today, they continue to be arranged. And that's justified, again, in a number of different ways. But it's a vestige in most of these societies of this notion of property transfer. So yeah, you can be a wife or a mother. What other opportunities are available to you? You can be a nun. That's one, right? So the Catholic societies and Orthodox societies will afford you that, and that will be a good explanation for why you didn't become a wife or a mother. What else? You basically have two more available to you. Yes, number 3 is going to be you can be a prostitute, which will be a recognized role within these societies. I mean, this is the world's oldest profession, as they call it, right? And it's not as if we don't know about prostitution existing in the ancient world. It's all over the Bible, for one thing. I mean, the Bible is one of the oldest representations that we have of the ancient world, now 3,000 years old. The fact that prostitutes appear, not just a couple times in the Bible tells us that it was something that existed and that obviously continues to. And the status of prostitutes was in a strange legal place. So they were obviously no longer under the control of their fathers, and prostitution was, of course, frowned upon as being a moral lapse on the part of the woman, obviously, and on the part of the men that patronized prostitutes. But it was very widely tolerated at the same time. And by a sort of a strange side effect of that was that some of the most some of the freest women in the ancient world were prostitutes, because they essentially didn't have a man to have to answer to on a legal basis. They did, however, have to answer to, you know, a pimp, or for that matter, a patron that was going to brutalize them. And so it was then and remains an extremely dangerous job. Last one. What is your fourth choice? No, you're not going to be. There's not going to be any single. There's not going to be women working in certainly not in service jobs. Yeah.
A teacher?
So you can be a teacher. That's going to become more common. But education is going to remain segregated, and the forms of education that are given are going to be different. But it's going to be basically the only job that's available to women. By the way, the fifth one is old maid. You can either through just poor luck, or because you choose not to, by this point in society, because you've refused every man that's been brought across your transom as a possible husband, you are now an old maid. And there's almost like a fear thing that is sort of attached to that, because it's like bad luck. You know, like if you've ever played the card game Old Maid, or if you're like me and you play hearts, then the Queen of Spades is the old maid in that game. It's the card you don't want to get stuck with, and that's something that comes down to us from the medieval period, along with playing cards. It symbolizes a woman that nobody wants, right? And what are those women like? They're like the mad woman in the attic. Mad woman in the attic is sort of a general term for old maids, women that have gone through menopause, widows who have lost their minds, childless women, generally speaking, because women who have children have people to take care of them in their dotage. But women that don't have children and that are no longer have their husband or never had one, because nobody's going to really understand menopause until much, much, much later. That's going to be a big excuse for locking people up and away from the public eye. So yeah, 5 choices basically: wife and mother, nun, teacher, prostitute, old maid. What's not happening is you guys in here, right, studying to be some kind of white-collar professional. So what is the solution? Well, Mary Wollstonecraft says that at the core of the solution is feminism, is the recognition of equal rights for men and women. And that's a goal. But in terms of the strategy of achieving that, she says that really where it has to focus is on education. So this is Mary Wollstonecraft. She works as a governess, and so a governess is a nanny. That falls sort of within the broader rubric of education, because they're also responsible for teaching children to do things like read. But that's obviously in the upper middle class and upper class. Illiteracy remains pretty widespread until the 19th century. So she published a book called A Vindication of the Rights of Men in 1790. So what happens is that in 1789, the French Revolution happens. And this is a watershed moment, historically speaking, for Europe for a lot of reasons. Obviously, for France, it's the most important, the effect is the greatest in France where it actually happens. But, if not for the British Channel, the English Channel, England would border France. And so the effects of the French Revolution in England are extremely deeply felt. And they are a combination of, and it does sort of break down on generational lines, deep fear on the part of the older generation, and real excitement on the part of the younger generation. The older generation, particularly those that have money and power, are deeply concerned that this idea is going to spread, and their heads are going to roll with the King of France and his wife. She's from the younger generation, so she's in this generation that are very excited about it. Now, it's also true that the person to whom she responds, Edmund Burke writes this this book called The Rights of Man. I'm sorry, he writes a book called Meditations on the French Revolution. And it's his immediate reaction to the events that are happening as the revolution, the monarchy being dissolved, the emergence of a republic, so on and so forth. And it's a deeply reactionary response to it. And so Burke has been identified, historically speaking, as essentially the father of conservative political thought. Because if left and right-wing political thought emerged from the French Revolution, and by and large they do, Burke is sort of the standard bearer of the right wing. And he's deeply suspicious because, right-wing politics are very much about maintaining social order and tradition. So he writes this book, Meditations on the French Revolution, and in response to it, first of all, in response, Thomas Paine writes The Rights of Man, which is probably the more noteworthy of the responses that are written to Burke. And then he comes to the United States and he writes Common Sense and foments the American Revolution and all of that. Mary Wollstonecraft writes Vindication of the Rights of Men, which expresses this Enlightenment tradition of equal rights. If Locke was right, the argument goes, and we are all born equal, then we should, under government, we should be equal. And the what's called the Ancien Regime, the old regime in France, that did not recognize that, and so it had to go. Then she travels to France, sees what is happening there, which is that there are very incipient early moves toward recognizing greater rights for women. And she writes then her sequel, Vindication of the Rights of Women, in the same year. So she gives birth to her first daughter, Fanny Imlay, in 1794. She is not married when she does this, and that is a scandal. But going on her desire for men and women, particularly men and women of a particular class, to be considered equal under the law, she does not hide this, and she does not, scurry away to marry by virtue of the fact that she has had a child. Because one of the things that we know about the upper classes in England in particular is that men always had mistresses, and that for a certain class, for the uppermost classes, the aristocracy and the nobility, it was almost expected that they would. And so and these men would often father children. And so the question is, if it's all right for men of a particular class to father children out of wedlock, then why is it not for a woman to have children out of wedlock as well? Returns to London, 1795. So she married a man named William Godwin, who was an important figure in his own right. He was in this tradition from which John Stuart Mill rose, of utilitarianism. And he was also one of the earliest political anarchists. They married, and she became pregnant with her daughter Mary, but she died while giving birth to her. So one of the big changes that happens, and I've mentioned this in passing before in the 19th century, is that infant mortality goes way down, and maternal mortality also go way down. But this is a not uncommon thing to happen before there's significant advances in medicine for women to die during childbirth. Anybody know who her daughter was, by the way? Her daughter was famous. More famous than she, as a matter of fact. Yes?
Was it Bloody Mary?
No, it was not. Anyone else? Her daughter was Mary Shelley. She wrote Frankenstein. So, the selection from Vindication of the Rights of Women is on page 593 of your book. So, now she is writing in the style of the late 18th century, rather. And so the extent to which she is able to communicate her ideas in a way that we are best able to understand is a little bit diluted, but not quite as bad as some of the other people we've read so far. So in this particular selection, she's talking about the poor state of education for women. You start about 5 lines down from that first paragraph on page 593. I've turned over various books written on the subject of education and patiently observed the conduct of parents and the management of schools, but what has been the result? A profound conviction that the neglected education of my fellow creatures is the grand source of misery I deplore, and that women in particular are rendered weak and wretched by a variety of concurring causes, originating from one hasty conclusion. The conduct and manners of women, in fact, evidently prove that their minds are not in a healthy state. For like the flowers which are planted into rich soil, strength and usefulness are sacrificed to beauty, and the flaunting leaves, after having pleased a fastidious eye, fade, regarded on the stalk long before the season when they ought to have arrived at maturity. One cause of this barren blooming I attribute to a false system of education gathered from the books written on the subject by men, who, considering females rather as women than human creatures, have been more anxious to make them alluring mistresses than affectionate wives and rational mothers, and the understanding of the sex has been so bubbled by the specious homage that the civilized women of the present century, with a few exceptions, are only anxious to inspire love when they ought to cherish a nobler ambition and by their abilities and virtues exact respect. So here's her argument, essentially, about education in a nutshell. And again, this builds on a basic assumption about the equality of men and women. If men and women are equal, then there's no inherent reason why women should end up in the particular condition that they are under in society at that point in time. Therefore, there has to be some external factor that causes this. Right? This is essentially a nature-nurture debate. And if it's not the inherent nature of women that leads to their, essentially the shallowness of women as she understands it, then it must be the way that they're brought up, because they're that way by the time they're young adult women, you know, in their late teens or early 20s, and as a result, it must be something about the way that they're being molded through their system of education. So, what goes on? Well, girls are trained for marriage and not much else. So the things that they learn in terms of actual sort of learning knowledge and skills comes down essentially to home economics. They are able to read, they are able to balance a checkbook, they are able to cook and clean and, quote, please their man. And that's what they're taught. I mean, in terms of the latter point, you know, it's you know, well, you know, what if he's terrible? Well, lie back and think of England. I mean, that's literally the advice. So it's not even as if you are being you know, schooled in the sensual arts or anything like that. You're basically being told that this is your wifely duty. So it is, and you know, then about child raising as well. Most of which will be thrown at you when it, you know, when you're about to be married, and then the rest of it thrown at you when you end up pregnant, usually very soon thereafter. So it's basically giving women a bare minimum. They're being taught to read at this point because there's leisure time now available in England as a result of a lot of things, not the least of which is colonialism and the tremendous wealth that it endows on England. People have free time. And so one of the things that happens, for instance, in the 17th century in England is that they create the novel. And the novel is actually developed first and foremost as a form for women to read, because women have much more free time than men do. And so they are given, usually in serialized format, stories that they can read about people that they imagine are somewhat like themselves, going through experiences that are not at all like their own, and in that way escape from the drudgery of everyday life. These novels are very much like, on an intellectual level, very much like soap operas. And it's not really until the 19th century that women begin writing serious fiction. And of course, when they do, they have to publish it by and large under men's names in order to have it taken seriously. So they're able to read to get by. You know, they need to be able to have the basic knowledge that's involved in that, but also to afford them some style of leisure, because remember, there's no radio or anything like that at this point, let alone television. And then home economics, some basic bookkeeping and cooking, cleaning, so on and so forth. So, last but not least, she says that there's, if you look at the, and this is the first full paragraph on 594, she says, in the true style of Mohammedanism, they are treated as a kind of subordinate beings and not as a part of the human species, when improvable reason is allowed to be the dignified distinction which raises men above the brute creation and puts a natural scepter in a feeble hand. So, Mohammedanism is the term that most people used for Islam back then. This is an incomplete understanding of the status of women in Islam, but it bears noting that the women's status in Islam is inferior to men's. There's really no disputing that. There's absolutely no disputing that it's different. And from at least applying the standards of Western nations, that status is both different and unequal. Women aren't allowed to be to give testimony in courts, not allowed to bring suit, can't sue for divorce, and so just on a legal level, women are subordinate to men under Muslim law. And it's that way, by the way, under Orthodox Jewish law as well. It's just that virtually no societies operate under Orthodox Jewish law, not even Israel. So, but she says that to think that there is a real qualitative difference between the way that women are subordinated in the Muslim world and the way that they are subordinated in the West is a mistake. Because the legal status thing is true in both places. It may be much more visible in the Muslim world because women are veiled, and because there's polygamy as well in the Muslim world, whereas there has not been in the West for hundreds of years. It's nevertheless true that women are subordinate, and that they are subjected to first their fathers and then their husbands in a very similar way to the manner that they are in the Islamic world. And so, just to repeat that last bit, improvable reason is allowed to be the dignified distinction which raises men above the brute creation and puts a natural scepter in a feeble hand. Which is to say that because the reason, and remember, reason is this thing that comes out of the Enlightenment, thinking about human beings, what distinguishes us from the animals. It used to be having a soul, and now it's having reason. She says even that notion about having reason, that's limited to men having reason. And that underwrites the whole process by which men have control over women. It's not just physical, she says. It is that even within this potentially equalizing force of the Enlightenment, there is a tendency to believe women don't have reason. And as a result of their not having reason, then only men are suitable to govern, and by extension to govern over women. That, she says, obviously does significant harm as well. She notes this, by the way, on this point about men being physically stronger, but also wanting to be societally stronger. That it is not sufficient for men to have the physical strength, but the intellectual strength, at least from the standpoint of the way they conceive of this matter of reason, translates into social strength as well. So, turn to 595. The next thing that she talks about here is that despite the things that she's already pointed out about the way that men and women are in a very unequal power relationship with one another, women bear some of the blame in this process. So this is the last full paragraph on 595. My own sex, I hope, will excuse me if I treat them like rational creatures instead of flattering their fascinating graces and viewing them as if they were in a state of perpetual childhood, unable to stand alone. I earnestly wish to point out in what true dignity and human happiness consists, I wish to persuade women to endeavor to acquire strength both of mind and body, and to convince them that the soft phrases susceptibility of heart, delicacy of sentiment, and refinement of taste are almost synonymous with epithets of weakness, and that those beings who are only the objects of pity and that kind of love which has been termed its sister will soon become objects of contempt. So here is, she says, what is the problem with women. And a way of thinking about it is to consider it within the context of talking about Martin Luther King in the previous class and the issues that he has with certain elements of the black population. Which is to say, there are certain members of the black population, he says, that drag their feet with regard to implementing actions that would accomplish equal rights and social justice for African Americans. There are the older generation, remember, who have lived under segregation and maybe even slavery, and therefore just can't even conceive of a change even being possible. But there's this other group of black Americans who are comfortable with the situation as they find it, who don't suffer, might even benefit from it to a certain extent, and for that reason don't want to make waves. Now, this is not to say that they don't have some sense of right and wrong, but charity begins at home. It's, you have to be able to take care of yourself before you can take care of other people, the argument goes. And so they don't emphasize this particular point. Now, there are a lot of kind of side effects of that kind of thinking, which is that there's internalized prejudice, for instance. If you are a woman living in a society where you're unequal, which is to say all societies in the 19th century, or the 18th century rather, then you can be angry about it or not angry about it. If you like your life the way that it is, then you're likely not going to be angry about it. If you don't, you're just, you're shit out of luck. It's not like you're going to really have any opportunity to change it. And what you might sort of pick up over time is that the better choice is not to be unhappy, and the way not to be unhappy is just not to think about it. And the way you don't think about it is by, distracting yourself with lots of things that aren't particularly engaging or intellectual or will likely to remind you of the situation in which you find yourself. And then the result of that is that you will not only be satisfied with the situation in which you find yourself, but you will defend it. You will say that this is the way that you want it. And that, she says, is where the real sort of problems lie. And it's an insidious kind of problem in the same way that for King, moderate politics are a problem. There are far less obvious representation of standing in the way of progress, but they stand in the way of progress equally effectively with a far lower likelihood of being detected. So this is part of the argument that then loops back to education. So why are women essentially, by the time they come to adulthood, why are they so silly as to even defend the situation in which they find themselves? And our answer is, well, because of this education that they're not getting. They're not being challenged to think, and because they're not challenged to think, it's just far more likely they're going to come to adulthood with no real ideas, with no critical thinking ability, because this is going to be accompanied to some extent by economic stability that they will enjoy. They won't question things. So this is the bottom of 596. The education of women has of late been more attended to than formerly, yet they are still reckoned a frivolous sex and ridiculed or pitied by the writers who endeavor by satire or instruction to improve them. It is acknowledged that they spend many of the first years of their lives in acquiring a smattering of accomplishments. Meanwhile, strength of body and mind are sacrificed to libertine notions of beauty, to the desire of establishing themselves the only way women can rise in the world, by marriage. And this desire, by making mere animals of them, when they marry, they act as such children may be expected to act. They dress, they paint, and nicknamed God's creatures, surely these weak beings are fit only for a seraglio. What is a seraglio? Because you are all very close readers, of course, of the textbook, and because as close readers of the textbook, when you come across a word that you do not understand or have never encountered before, the first thing you do is immediately, if not sooner, grab the dictionary, which of course you keep close at hand when you're reading, and look up this word that you do not understand. So what does this word mean? Seraglio. It means brothel, whorehouse, or harem, in the sort of the older sense of the word. The harem, is where in the Islamic world, the sultan's concubines are kept, not his wives, his concubines. Because again, there is this accepted notion that that men of a certain social class and status have sex with women that they're not married to. Of course they do. How could they not? And because these are the women that the king has sex with, and because he might have children by them, although they won't be entitled to his property. That, after all, is what illegitimate means. It doesn't mean that the children are illegal. It means they have no legal claim to his property. He might like them and want to leave them something, so he's going to want to be sure that those children are his as well. So there will be no men allowed in the harem, with two exceptions: the sultan himself, of course, and who's the other man that's allowed in the harem? You're trying to remember the word.
I can visually see. The vizier?
No, the vizier is like the prime minister. He's like a very powerful guy, and usually he's like challenges the king for power in some sense. Yeah.
Isn't it like the observer, like the teacher, kind of like prepares them?
No, because a woman does that. No, the other man that's allowed in the harem besides the sultan is the eunuch. It's the castrated man. And this is for two reasons. First of all, because if you castrate a man at the right age, he will become enormous, very big and muscular, and therefore quite scary, A. And B, he's not going to have sex with the women in the harem because he can't. So he's going to be the perfect guard to have there. It's literally going to be the only job that these people have. They will be castrated specifically for that purpose. But they will, they'll get other ancillary benefits. They'll live in the palace, they'll get all the food they want, so on and so forth, and all of that. The ancient world is a hell of a place. So that was a bit of a digression, but it does make a point about subjection of women, and more importantly, about unequal social expectations of men and women, particularly men and women of elevated class. Because what we don't have anywhere is women, powerful women that have a harem of men from which they can choose to have sex with. Nor, for that matter, do we have all but just a very small number of cultures, again, that will allow a woman to have more than one husband. Although until Christianity, basically, it is absolutely commonplace, particularly if you're wealthy enough, that a man is going to have several wives. Now that happens for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that in the ancient world, where military power is important and you need soldiers, you need large populations, and while a woman can only be pregnant by one man at a time, a man can impregnate literally a limitless number of women. And so if you want to grow a population, you have polygamy. Second, polygyny, I should say, the taking of multiple wives. The other part of that is that it's a property thing. And a status symbol. If I'm wealthy enough, I can have as many wives as I can possibly afford. And so men who are fantastically wealthy, monarchs and things like that, they will have dozens, perhaps hundreds of wives and concubines, right? King Solomon in the Bible has 300 wives and 700 concubines. The big reform of that comes with Islam, when the number is limited to 4. So, that is your inequality with regard to moral expectation, and that's, by the way, justified to a certain extent by assumptions about inherent differences between men and women. right? It's boys will be boys versus girls have to be, their chastity has to be protected and set aside, and all of these things. And again, there might first of all, there might be biological explanations for some of that. You can't completely put that aside. And second of all, there might be any number of religious, cultural contexts that help to explain that. But ultimately, what underlies it is this notion of proof of paternity. How can I be sure my children are mine? So, because these women are, and that's why she brings up Australia, by the way, because if you are educating in these women in these manner, then the only thing that you're really making them fit for is to have sex with. And for men, that's probably not going to be a problem. For women, she says, first of all, it's affording women in life far less than what women have a right to, importantly. But she says also that there's an underside of this that men might not have considered. So, top of 597, that first paragraph, she says, at the end of that paragraph, I presume that rational men will excuse me for endeavoring to persuade them to become more masculine and respectable. Indeed, the word masculine is only a bugbear. There is little reason to fear that women will acquire too much courage or fortitude, for their apparent inferiority with respect to bodily strength must render them in some degree dependent on men in the various relations of life. But why should it be increased by prejudices that gives a sex to virtue and confound simple truths with sensual reveries? So, part of what she's talking about here is this division that arises when you conceive of psychology in a way that creates a divide between intellect and emotion. If intellect is identified with reason, and only men have that, then women are emotional and have no reason. And when you split things up that way, then of course women are going to be sexualized, overly sexualized in particular by men, and not valued in any other capacity, because you're going to tie all of that stuff, all of the emotional stuff, the icky stuff, with sex, whereas you're going to tie the intellectual stuff, the reason stuff, with accomplishment and with social status. Women are in fact so much degraded by mistaken notions of female excellence that I do not mean to add a paradox when I assert that this artificial weakness produces a propensity to tyrannize and gives birth to cunning, the natural opponent of strength, which leads them to play off those contemptible infantine airs that undermine esteem even whilst they excite desire. So here's the wrinkle that she provides. It says, okay, well, you can sort of dote on us and treat us like children and over-sexualize us, basically turning us into playthings. But because you can't actually lobotomize us, among some number of us, there's going to emerge cunning. There's going to emerge a certain underhanded slyness. She continues. Let men become more chaste and modest, and if women do not grow wiser in the same ratio, it will be clear that they have weaker understandings. It seems scarcely necessary to say that I now speak of the sex in general. Many individuals have more sense than their male relatives, and as nothing preponderates where there is constant struggle for an equilibrium, without it has naturally more gravity. Some women will govern their husbands without degrading themselves, because intellect will always govern. So, a few things here. First of all, again, you can't excise the intellect from a woman entirely, because, again, returning to her basic ground assumptions, men and women are essentially the same. We could say only men have reason, but that doesn't actually make it true. And so socially consigning women to an inferior status is going to, in a certain number of them, give rise to cunning. And she says that is going to give rise to a tendency for women to deceive their husbands. And furthermore, to deceive their husbands, she builds the argument by steps. can't take away the intellect of women, but you subordinate them in status. This gives rise to cunning. And then on top of it, you have over-sexualized women. So now you have taken these intellectual yet stunted, sexualized creatures, and now, as a side effect of the way that you treated them, now they are cunning and deceiving. What's going to happen? They're going to have sex with other men. Because, after all, that's what you've trained them to do. You've trained them to have sex. You've basically told them that that's where their worth is embedded entirely. But you're not engaging them intellectually at all. So the smarter ones in particular, when they get bored, and when they get horny, they're going to have sex with the men that are around rather than with their husbands. And as a result, you're not going to be sure that your children are your own. Now, that last part she does not say, but what she implies is that you are undermining the whole reason this project exists in the first place. If the idea of controlling women was that you were going to have certainty about the paternity of your posterity, then you are badly undermining that in the way that you are currently doing things. And what actually happens within a society like England is that because it is not a society where women are heavily socially controlled, like in the ancient world, or like in certain corners of the Islamic world, like Saudi Arabia today, where there is so much social control over women that the question of their infidelity basically is completely removed from the equation. That hasn't existed in England for hundreds of years by the time this is being written. But women also do not have free equal rights, second. And third, they have a ton of leisure time because of the wealth of the society, comparatively speaking to other societies in Europe at that time. So it's like idle hands being the devil's workshop. It is a society in which you have a lot of women with a lot of time on their hands, and with not a lot of ways to be engaged socially other than with their husbands. That, she says, is a formula for adultery. Now, she brings this back, by the way, to this whole issue of a sexual double standard. And this is her challenge, essentially, to her male readership. Let men and women be equal under the law. And if this problem of adultery, of women cheating on their husbands, continues, then you can say that we're actually inferior, that we are in some way morally substandard to you. But until you give us the opportunity to be equal and have the same opportunities that you have to develop our intellects in the same way, for that matter to be morally taught like adults, like you are, then you can't certainly say that we have made these choices of our own full volition. So you cannot impose a sexual double standard, and you make it even more the case that it is unfair when you stack the deck against us from the very beginning by subordinating us from the time that we're children. Give us an equal ground to play on, and then we'll see who's right. Either the men that oppose her assertion of desired equality are right, or she's right. But the only way that we'll ever know for sure is by equaling the playing field. So we'll talk about in the next class the Seneca Falls Declaration, and that is available online. So that will be in the course materials. In the meantime, the United States and the UK are different countries. So the way that women's rights develop in the United States, which is where the Seneca Falls Declaration comes from, and the way they develop in the UK are quite different. But the main thing is that what it will hinge on more than anything else in both of these societies will be the right to vote, which is not something that that at least in the selection from Wollstonecraft, she engages with at this point. But as we continue to sort of look at this this movement and the intellectual underpinnings of it, it's a point to keep in mind. So I'm going to stop here. Are there any questions? And a little bit short, but that way you can all you can get right down to reading your next week's selections and being sure that you are maybe read it twice, 3 times. Just to be sure that you really know it like the back of your hands, and that any words that you look up, like seraglio, for instance, are not ones that you've forgotten by the time you sit here, because that would be bad. Any questions before I dismiss you for the night? All right, I will see you Tuesday.